Welcome. Joining me today is Alex from Donbass, Devushka. I have had the pleasure of being on Donbass, Devushka, their podcast twice, and now I'm having Alex, one member of the team, here with us today, and I have military experience in the U.S. military. We know of many other former U.S. military experts speaking out about the situation in Ukraine. Alex has a very interesting background, military background. He has a Russian military background. So, Alex, thank you for joining me. And why don't you introduce yourself, Donbass Davushka, and then we'll get into our main topic, which is the Russian Battalion Tactical Group.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on. I am simply Alex. I am a former and current Russian serviceman. I had undergone conscripted service, I had done my mandatory, and then I had left to pursue a medical education, and now I have returned to serve in the Russian Federation Armed Forces Medical Service. I am one of the co-hosts of the show Calibrated on the Donbass Devushka podcast. You can find us on Spotify. We have a Telegram channel, Donbass Devushka. Make sure to follow us. We keep lots of interesting news on. And follow our podcast and our locals, where you can hear us discuss various cultural, military, and historical matters.
Excellent. And the links to everything will be in the video description below, as well as a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. So we want to talk about the Russian Battalion Tactical Group, but before we even get into that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the Russian military in general, where they get their manpower from, what is the process like, and I just want to introduce people to this right here. This is from 2017, The Russian Way of War. It is by two people with a background in the Russian language and also the U.S. military, and this was published by the U.S. Army University Press, and I would say that it gives a very different impression about the Russian military than what we usually hear from across the Western media. And just a couple of things I want to put out there, and then Alex, you can add onto it or correct me if I'm wrong. They say that there's a lot of programs that try to prepare the potential pool for conscription before they're even conscripted. Programs for vocational training, different types of sports that have I guess you could say, a dual use in a military setting, so that when they conscript young men, they already have a skill set that is useful to the military. So how about you get into that? Where does Russia get its manpower for its military before we start talking about the Russian Battalion Tactical Group?
So let's begin sort of at the age of about 17. In the January to March of the year that a young man has turned 17, he will be first placed onto the military register. He will arrive at a facility where sort of primary medical testing will take place. His psyche, his physical condition, and so on will be evaluated, and he will be categorized A through E, if we were to go sort of, change languages, obviously. But categories A and B go straight in. When they turn 18, they get conscripted. C, or Ver in Russian, they go straight into the reserve. And then D and E are either temporarily unfit for service or permanently unfit for service and will not be conscripted sort of under any circumstances, whether this be for disability reasons or otherwise.
After that, the basic training that first of all, are there programs before you are conscripted? Are there programs in Russia today that kind of gets you ready? I mean, is vocational training in the U.S., at least when I was going through school there, was not emphasized at all. It was something you had to specifically seek out and do. and it was generally looked down upon. And I think this has had a huge impact, because it didn't always used to be that way in the US. I think it's had a huge impact on America, its industry, and just the way it is as a society. What about in Russia? Do young men who are conscripted into the Russian military, do they have skills that are useful for military service before they even undergo their training?
So this is a fascinating question because, very interestingly, this has changed this year. As of, say, October or so of 2022, the decision was made to reintroduce the Soviet-era beginner military education into schools mandatorily. For the last 2 years of their school education, young men and women will receive at least 140 hours over these 2 years of military preparation, how to disassemble an AK, basic tactics, etc., etc. And of course, in Russia, the polytechnical universities and so on are by no means demeaned upon. It is simply a person's choice how they wish to contribute to their motherland. Effectively, also actually in these polytechnical colleges, which can be taken instead of the last 2 years of school, this preparatory military training will also be introduced. But this some sort of system of having the last 2 years of school teach kids, things like how to properly attach a filter onto a gas mask, how to change it, when to know how to change it, how to quickly get into a NBC suit, etc. This has existed. It had existed from the 20s to 47, after which it was cancelled for non-vocational classes, and then until 65, it was cancelled for vocational classes. And then in 1967, that is, it was reintroduced for all youths of the Soviet Union, where they were prepared for conscription. Of course, the Soviet Union was mainly a conscript force, where this perhaps could have been more important, but we are seeing this return in Russia, perhaps as a sign of things to come, or perhaps to produce a conscript force that doesn't fit the stereotype of a conscripted force anymore, of sort of people who have no idea of the military, dragged in kicking and screaming into the military commissariats, and forced out onto the front line with an AK and 2 magazines.
Yes, and vocational skills could cover a wide range of subjects, things like welding, basic mechanics. These are things that, at least in the U.S. military, if that is going to be your military occupation specialty, you have to train from scratch to learn how to do these skills in the military. If in Russia you're getting a vocational education before being conscripted, then there would be a certain number of potential candidates to go and do these jobs who will already have a little bit of a foundation regarding these skills. Is that correct?
Mind you, shop classes in Russia are a thing. They are mandatory, much like sports classes, healthy mind, healthy body. But in a sense, every child learns, your basics of woodworking, of metalworking, how to fix a flat tire, sort of a little home econ is usually taught as well. But all in all, this prepares both physically and mentally. Of course, every young man knows that he will go on to serve his country. So they prepare in the mindset of, if I am to do this, then perhaps it is best I be as good at it as I can possibly be.
And then there's the conscription force, and then there is the professional force, and I think we could also get into reservists. Who makes up the reservist population? Who are these men that are being called back during the mobilization? So, can you give us a little bit of insight into the difference between the conscripts and the professional force, and who are these reserves that were mobilized? Are they raw recruits, as the Western media depicts them as, or are these, as I understand, men with a military background, military training? They've already served, and they were then reservists and then called back.
Well, in that sense, we have sort of a number of different options. The what we would call contract soldiers have all been conscripts. They simply chose to remain as part of the Russian military. So they have better pay, they have opportunities for growth up into the officer cadre, etc., etc. But the conscripts, at the age of 18, there is a spring and a fall call up. They arrive, they go through their medicals, they get boot camped, they swear their oath to their country, and then they do their service. But in the case of reservists, the much maligned Western topic of, ooh, Russia's, recruiting 18-year-olds off the street. No, Russia has had perhaps either the fortune or misfortune, depending on who you ask, of having fought several high-intensity conflicts recently. We had 08, against the Georgians. We had Chechnya 1 and 2. The men who fought in that are still of reserve age. And we had Syria, of course, where the Russian military, as it is now, in its sort of current iteration, had been blooded had been originally blooded, and then from there we go onto Ukraine. Furthermore, we have had reservists who were in Ukraine and their contract simply ended. So they got home, they took the mandatory period of rest, and then they either volunteered or were called up again, and they rejoined their units, effectively still at their prime and fully trained and having undergone combat cohesion. So we've ended up with a reserve pool that is both experienced, skilled, and physically fit to undergo the correct amount of, shall we say, physical activity necessary for combat.
And then will there be a certain number of these reservists who were never in combat, but they did their period of time that they were supposed to serve, and then they were under reservist status, and then they were called back? What type of training would they have now going to Ukraine? And are there different units that are sent directly into the theater, and now we hear about all of this additional training that the reservists are going or undergoing? Is everyone getting that training, or only certain groups of soldiers getting it because they feel like they need this extra training?
Well, it's not by choice. So you cannot say that, oh, I do not wish to participate in X and Y training programs, I shall go. No, you will be tested. It will be determined whether you need to or not. But there will certainly be reservists who had only ever undergone their mandatory conscripted military service. Every single man who has done that is placed on the reservists, shall we say, ledger, which sort of produces Russia's absolutely gargantuan mobilizational pool for any, shall we say, future large-scale armed conflict. But you were saying in terms of how long do people take? So at one extreme, we have men who had been in combat in Ukraine not 2 weeks before they were called up again. They go straight into their units. These are men they know they know how it's done. They know how that particular battalion or detachment or specialist detachment works, etc., etc. The men almost entirely unfamiliar with it, or the men who have been out for a long time, they will be trained almost as raw. It will be assumed that they can handle a firearm and they can shoot straight, but otherwise they will redo all of the physical aspects of it. They will go through all of the physical training again. They will mandatorily have to go through combat cohesion because, for example, the 0808 troops will not have fought in battalion tactical groups. So to them, it will be a bit of a different world. So there are these varying stages, which is why we've seen some reservists get to the front much quicker. So at this point, what we have now in terms of the reservists undergoing training in Lugansk, Rostov, Kazan, and so on and so forth, are the men who have either been out for the longest or have had no experience in combat cohesive environments, shall we say, in stratified battalion groups, etc. So they will be training alongside all of the varying parts of their particular battalion tactical group, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But they will be instructed on close artillery support, how not to react when shells are going off next to you because they're friendly. They will be trained on how to support tanks on a breakthrough, how to move between friendly armored vehicles so as to not, get crushed under the treads, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the process that reservists go through.
Okay, and that is a good explanation, because I had suspected, and I think that we all saw reservists going into the theater immediately, and also large numbers undergoing additional training. So that is a very good explanation. Now, you said the battalion tactical group, and the battalion tactical group, and of course all kinds of military technology that exists now that may not have existed or was in use when these reservists served. So why don't we get into the battalion tactical group, which demands that we talk about the technology that is being used by the Russian military currently. Why don't you introduce to us what a battalion tactical group is, its history, because they didn't always have battalion tactical groups. So why do they have battalion tactical groups? And then we could get into the details of this unit, which I have been telling people is essentially the basic unit that Russia has organized its military around. But I could be wrong. You could correct us.
Sure. Well, with the battalion tactical group, like with most things Russian military related, we start with the Great Patriotic War. During the conflict with Nazi Germany, the Red Army had used effectively prototypes of the battalion tactical group, modeled somewhat after the German Kampfgruppe, known as either strengthened or assault battalions, which would have either artillery divisions or rocket artillery, Katyusha batteries attached to it, etc., etc. This would be strengthened by the commander, so he would effectively, call up whatever was serving near if they were required to help force a position or, cover a flank, etc. During, shall we say, the worst period of Russia's military history, the 90s and early 2000s, the prototype of the battalion tactical group was created more out of necessity than it was anything else. The average Russian division at the time could perhaps squeeze out a regiment of combat-ready troops, but could still provide a large amount of vehicles, of engineering support, and artillery, which would have been too much for said battalion, and therefore necessitated that all of that be condensed into a denser armored fist. During the Second Chechen War, the regimental tactical group was first devised. This is perhaps a rather significant amount larger than the battalion tactical group we talk about today. This was usually done in its simplest form by saturating a regular motor rifle detachment with artillery support. You'd attach a certain amount of howitzers, or you would have a mortar battery come with you, etc. So every regiment at its core feeds from what we call its mother, which is the division, via something we refer to as the umbilical. Unfortunately, the prenatal analogies do not end here. Basically, this division allows your regiment to rotate men in and out, rotate broken or damaged vehicles for new ones, etc., etc. It allows you to resupply. All of this is done through what one calls the umbilical. The regiment, at that point in the Russian army's history, was the smallest military formation one might say, that was capable of any task, whether it was to take a city, to defend, to, dig in, etc., etc. It was also incredibly mobile. The entire regiment could pack up and be on its merry way before any large enemy force, for example, on foot, had made it after detecting said regiment in the field. It was capable of attack, defense, any sort of military maneuver that was available at the time or that the strategies of the time necessitated. These regiments included their own armor, so tanks, artillery, air defense, communications, recon, engineers, and NBC troops, effectively. This regiment was also capable, most importantly, of feeding, healing, fixing, and servicing its men and machines, and therefore could remain at optimal combat effectiveness throughout a protracted combat. But obviously, the most important thing about both the regimental tactical group of yore and the battalion tactical group of now is mobility. The entire purpose of this detachment is to ensure that you are as mobile as possible so as to adapt to any enemy maneuver or your own maneuver or an order that comes down suddenly.
I'm going to go to this diagram, which I think is just a basic representation, because I think as you're going to explain, it can a battalion tactical group can take many forms, all depending on the mission, because it is part of a much larger unit, but this is the combat ready component, and the rest of the unit is going to help sustain this battalion tactical group out in the field. Is that correct?
Absolutely. What you're showing here is a very good, shall we say, image of the skeleton of a battalion tactical group. This is what you would start with, and then you would add on more and more and more depending on exactly what the situation called for. So our idea, sort of the genesis of the battalion tactical group, came from observing the US Brigade Combat Team, which I'm sure you are very familiar with, wherein the brigade would go on a mission, and then the brigade's one or two battalions, reinforced by the brigade's own armor and so on, would then go on and do the individual missions while the brigade remained entrenched in a permanent dislocation position, etc. After the Northern Caucasus conflict, we too began shifting to this sort of battalion model and the overarching brigade and divisions above it. The divisions and brigades of the Russian army at the time, following Defense Minister Serdyukov's reforms, began forming combat battalions reinforced by the rest of the detachment. This first came into combat and into fruition in the Georgian War, 08-08-08. The shock of the Georgians, sort of the original, I hesitate to use the term blitzkrieg, but the original Russian strike came in the form of two BTGs that charged down, I do not recall the name of the tunnel, but effectively appeared in southern Ossetia over the course of perhaps half an hour. You had two whole BTGs deployed, and they caused enough havoc to keep the Georgian forces occupied for the rest of the 58th Army to then make their way at a more leisurely pace, shall we say, through this tunnel. Yeah, effectively.
And we look at the different components in the battalion tactical group. Now, the brigade combat team, they actually have to call on other units for things like air defense or artillery. This is pretty much everything all in one unit. When you look at this basic structure, you have mechanized infantry, you have tanks, main battle tanks, you have anti-tank units, you have air defense, you also have self-propelled artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems. It's a very powerful unit all in and of itself, and the brigade combat team is actually much bigger, but it does not have as much firepower concentrated the way the battalion tactical group does. And we're actually going to get into that in a little bit. But maybe talk about some of the actual equipment that is in the modern battalion tactical group, and then maybe get into how it's being used in Ukraine, or some examples of how it has been used in Ukraine.
So what you are showing here is what we would consider the original skeleton of a battalion tactical group, so what you are displaying here is effectively the battalion component of it, where the name comes from. It's three motor rifle companies, a tank company, 1 to 2 artillery companies, a mortar company, which may not be included, at least a division of anti-aircraft, referred there as battery. You would have either ATGM teams, ATGM carriers, or a different variety of anti-tank equipment. Yes, exactly, the anti-tank company. You would have all of your communications, your electronic warfare, and so on, all in one company. You would have a UAV detachment now, as of the Ukrainian conflict, where these are proven, utterly, you know, they have changed the battlefield
Essential.
in
Yeah.
exactly essential. They've changed the battlefield in many a way.
And
Either
we're talking about, just so listeners know, the Orlan drone, at least the Orlan drone, and then most likely these commercial style drones that we see employed in such large numbers. I would almost have to uh, be certain that they're also included as equipment deployed to these units.
the smaller commercial drones, they usually go 1 or 2 apiece to the motor rifle companies. The Orlan drone, yes, will certainly be its own company as part of the BTG. And then perhaps you could have a Lancet operator company in the event that there will be enemy artillery somewhere within your area of operations that you may want to remove at a extreme distance, or in particular if you want to remove it from stealth. So effectively, the battalion itself, the originating structure of this tactical group, is the smallest Russian formation with a dedicated HQ, which we see at the top of your diagram there. So the entire purpose of this battalion, etc., is to be able to minimize the number of steps from the man firing the gun on the front line to HQ in Moscow. The battalion tactical group achieves this in effectively 2 steps. The command comes in from HQ in Moscow to the battalion commander, and then from him it is immediately relayed to the combat teams on the ground. So the time difference is minimal, if any can be, considered in terms of military time.
For me, I understand that there are BTGs deployed in Ukraine. In the very beginning of the conflict, I thought this was interesting, was the BTG was almost a buzzword among the Western media. Now we don't really hear them talking about it that much. But let's just say, for an example, Kherson, when Russian forces were on the west bank of the Dnieper River, you had all of these battalion tactical groups together. How do they organize multiple battalion tactical groups? Because I honestly believe, this is just, I wasn't sitting in on the general staff meeting when they set up the defenses, but I believe that they organized almost a divisional level of defenses around Kherson. How do these battalion tactical groups interact and organize and cooperate together? And yeah, let's just start with that first. That's a big enough topic.
Well, a lot about comms is, of course, highly classified, unfortunately, but every battalion is, of course, in contact with every other battalion. And when organizing a divisional level defense, as was indeed organized in the Kherson region, you have a common resupply. The term we use is placenta. So, as I said, the neonatal analogies do not end there. But this common mother, or placenta, shall we say, was able to both communicate back and forth with the separate battalions. It also allowed them all to be resupplied commonly, so they had one supplied train, as the term is, and it allowed the battalions, which are themselves highly mobile, to mount a mobile defense. They would inflict horrific attrition on the Ukrainian forces, and when it seemed that the balance was about to tip in the Ukrainians' favor, they would move back to the next pre-prepared position and rinse and repeat until the Ukrainian advance was either shattered or, as was the case, the order to withdraw was given. So you would retreat back, say, 10 kilometers. Your artillery's still in range, some of your other weapons aren't. You would shell the bejesus out of the Ukrainians advancing, demoralize them, inflict heavy attrition on them. Then your armored components, if, for example, one of the BTGs was an armored one, the three motor rifle companies, if you could indicate them,
It's these.
yes, would be replaced by tank companies, and the one tank company would be a motor rifle company. So if one of the three BTGs, or four BTGs, for example, was one of those, you would send them in first, of course, as the breakthrough troops, and then they would begin the mopping up procedure of the Ukrainian advance, and then you'd return back to position one, and then wait for the next offensive.
And this is something that even the Western media has talked about, the lopsided nature of the fighting around Kherson, and lopsided in Russia's favor, not Ukraine's. And the tremendous losses that Ukraine suffered at Kherson and also Kharkov. Uh, to be honest, this is the reason why we're talking about NATO giving Ukraine essentially another army's worth of equipment, because they lost it because the defenses around Kherson were so effective using this method. Now, is there any instant that you can think of, or maybe not, where they would combine two battalion tactical groups and have a common command, or something like, or like uh, making them larger for some reason, or is that something that doesn't happen, or we're just not aware of it because it's not something that the Ministry of Defense talks about?
This is absolutely possible. The size of the battalion tactical group is fluid. You can have a battalion tactical group that numbers soldiers, in a size that would dwarf divisions, for example. It would still have one common commander, who would be several ranks perhaps higher than the typical battalion tactical group commander. He could be flown in, for example, specifically to administrate this larger cohesive unit. For example, if we take your battalion tactical group diagram and we reinforce the artillery, say quadruple fold, and add another SAM battery to ensure that the artillery remains intact, all of a sudden you have a significantly larger force that is able to inflict significantly more damage at longer range. And of course, if you have that much artillery, you want more spotting. So then you add in another two Orlan squads, and then all of a sudden the thing has ballooned all over again. And your supply train will have to increase for all of the new ammo, etc., 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 ad infinitum.
And another aspect about the battalion tactical group that I've heard mentioned across the Western media and by Western analysts is the fact that it's a little bit infantry light. There's not enough infantry to support, say, this structure that we see on the screen. They would normally deploy the battalion tactical group and have, say, the militias in the Donbass region provide the bulk of the infantry, or you see Wagner, or you see these other very now famous infantry formations on the ground working together with the battalion tactical groups. Is this seen as a problem by the Russian Ministry of Defense, or is this something that they feel they are handling well the way it is? Is there any talk about adding a larger infantry component to the battalion tactical groups? Is this something that's going to change now that there's been the mobilization and there's a much larger pool of soldiers to work with?
Well, I don't believe so, actually. Firstly, the purpose of the Battalion Tactical Group is mobility. Every single motor rifle infantryman in the Battalion Tactical Group has a seat on a BTR. The entire force can travel mounted. It's sort of kind of the overarching point of its existence is that every single person there has a vehicle that they can travel in much faster than they can walk in. The battalion tactical group can just as easily interact with non-tactical group formations, such as infantry battalions, motor rifle battalions, or full-on infantry battalions of, say, the 1st and 2nd Army Corps, of the People's Militia, of the DPR or LPR. Wagner assault troops are an entirely separate classification
Yeah. Yes.
of formation. They are assault battalions. They function entirely differently yet again. But I do not believe that there is any discussion as to expanding the infantry component. If you want to expand the amount of infantry you have in a battalion tactical group, you would attach a motor rifle company with its vehicles mandatorily.
Okay, and that goes back to the flexibility of the battalion tactical group and the ability to take any one of these components and just add in more or swap them accordingly, depending on what the mission calls for. Okay, so I think we've hit just about everything in terms of the composition and the use of the battalion tactical group. We talked about the battalion tactical group fighting. And then maybe we can talk about fighting the battalion tactical group. And I've mentioned this many times in my updates because I more or less I see the Ukrainians adopting the recommendations made in this paper. This is written by a U.S. Army captain. It's published by Fort Benning, U.S. Army Fort Benning, and it's titled "Defeating the Russian Battalion Tactical Group." And rather than reading through this whole thing, I'll just summarize it and say that they understand that the battalion tactical group has a massive amount of firepower, and what they want to do is attack using many men, many machines across a wide front, making it more difficult for the battalion tactical group to concentrate its firepower in any one direction. They will cause massive casualties for whoever is trying to attack the battalion tactical group, but they feel as if they can close that distance fast enough and begin inflicting losses on the battalion tactical group because it's adverse to losses. You see this amount of equipment. They don't want to lose any of this. They want to try to preserve this as much as possible. They will withdraw. Kind of, Alex, the way you said, they will move back to another prepared defensive position. It'll compel them to move back. And maybe if the charge against the battalion tactical group is successful enough, it could compel them to withdraw entirely. So that is basically that paper summarized. I don't know if you had any time to look through it, Alex, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, fighting the battalion tactical group is mostly an attempt. You would have to attempt to attrite it, especially if the battalion tactical group was deployed specifically to halt your advance. It will have absolutely everything it needs to do so. Your options are a suicidal flanking maneuver in an attempt to cut the umbilical cord. Alternatively, you could try and throw bodies at it until it runs out of ammo, which is potentially possible, though by no means recommended. The biggest downside of the battalion tactical group is the amount of time it takes to achieve the cohesion required to, to fight as one. It's one of the reasons it's taking so long to get the mobilized men onto the front. This particular detachment requires a very significant amount of combat cohesion, especially if it is modified to add in various extra companies, etc., because all of them will have to once again retrain to act as part of this unit and be trained in completing the very particular mission that it requires as part of its objectives from headquarters.
Yes, this is combined arms warfare. This is not, I know how to operate a tank and now I'm just going to go to war in my one tank. No, you have to be able to looking at this diagram, the tank company has to know how to fight as a tank company. They have to know how to fight as a single tank, a tank company, and also part of the battalion tactical group. And every single unit in this diagram, they need to be able to do that. I believe the number, the basic battalion tactical group is anywhere between 600 to 800 men, if I'm not mistaken. And so the problem is, and we've seen Ukraine doing this, we've seen them just throwing bodies at the battalion tactical group, trying to exhaust it. At different junctures of the battle or the offensive toward Kherson, we actually heard Western analysts say that they are just trying to wear down the battalion tactical groups, they'll run out of ammunition. They were hitting the bridges across the Dnieper River, and that was actually their plan. Now, we see the mobilization. We're starting to get an idea of the battalion tactical group. And then I just want to go back to this and get your opinion on this. This New York Times article about these extensive defensive structures that Russia is building. I mean, it's tank traps, trenches, dragon's teeth. I think they have a diagram down here, kind of a very simplified cross-section of what they're talking about, and maps about where they are in the east and to the south. I'm thinking that in addition to the battalion tactical group being able to fight a mobile defense, then you have these lines that are going to be very difficult for Ukraine to use this strategy of trying to rush toward the battalion tactical group. If there is obstacles like this in between themselves and these oncoming Ukrainian forces, whether they're in Soviet-era tanks or they're in Western NATO main battle tanks, I think it's going to keep them in the battlefield longer and subject them to this withering fire that the battalion tactical group is capable of for longer periods of time. Alex, what is your take on this?
Well, in terms of defense, there is always the possibility that a battalion tactical group can be rolled back into the brigade that originated it, and then that brigade can be stuck in defense because it does not necessarily require the high mobility component that the BTG gives it. So if you have this brigade sitting in defense, it no longer has a resupply train because the brigade carries everything with it. It no longer requires rotations of troops because the brigade is all of its own troops. So all of a sudden you have a significantly more monolithic static defense detachment that may in fact be even harder to attack than the BTG itself. The brigade cannot go on the offensive quite as easily because it is slow and cumbersome, but when sat in a defense like, say, the Zaporozhye direction, etc., where our battalion tactical groups are now attacking, in fact, when these brigades are fully unfolded, they can man these defenses against wave upon wave of Ukrainians riding any machine that they so desire from the west. Effectively, they will run into an immovable object. And the Ukrainian army is hardly an unstoppable force.
Yes, and this is what I myself have been predicting, and I hear many other people bringing this up, that if they fared as poorly as they did during the Kharkov and Kherson offensives, with Russia taking these extra preparations, bringing in this additional manpower, it's going to make it actually much harder for any future Ukrainian offensive, no matter what equipment they have. And as a matter of fact, this new equipment that they're receiving, as we were just explaining with the battalion tactical group, it takes time to train on this. It's not just learning the weapon system itself. It's about learning how to use it in combined arms warfare as part of a a unit and other units that we didn't even talk about air power and how the battalion tactical group interacts with Russian military aviation, and that could be an entirely different conversation, unless you have something you really want to say about that.
I mean, in terms of aviation and army aviation, they are entirely separate. Effectively, for coordinating with them, that's what you have your communication systems for. You provide cover for them with your own air defense systems in the event of counter-launching aircraft or something to that extent. So you protect them as much as they protect you.
Okay, and I want to go back to this. When I was reading this, they kind of dispelled a lot of the stereotypes that the Western media is still completely saturated with. The fact that Russian military commanders are rigid, inflexible. The troops can't improvise, cannot adapt and overcome to anything on the battlefield, and that the Russian military is incapable of learning. Well, this paper, this says the exact opposite. It says Russians are very, very good at learning, learning from their mistakes, changing when they need to. And I think we've actually seen that all throughout the special military operation. We've seen Russia make decisions that had huge costs politically, but were militarily sound. And we see them make those type of decisions over and over and over again. Would you say that the Russian military commanders and the way they approach things, are they flexible? Are they very quick at learning? I just want to talk about the HIMARS for just a moment, because I was talking about the prospects of the U.S. sending ATACMS to Ukraine. And I mentioned an article where Ukraine itself admitted that Russia has already adapted to the HIMARS and that they're not really as effective as they would want them to be. This is why they need ATACMS, as if Russia is not going to also adapt to them. Do you have anything to say on that matter?
Well, firstly, if we go back to the battalion tactical group for a second, the fact that there is effectively only one person between HQ and the men fighting does, in fact, help with, quickly relaying orders. The battalion tactical group commander himself has a large amount of leeway. He is given an overall objective, i.e. take height 12, and he is to take that however he finds expedient and in whatever configuration of battalion tactical group he may wish. On the topic of adjusting, well, firstly, we've seen the T-72 modernized with extra ERA plating in places that before were found to be weak following destructions and sort of damage to the tanks that have been deployed. The topic of the HIMARS has been beat to death at this point, but just recently we had a wonderful video of a Panzer system destroying all 12 of a double HIMARS launch or a single M270 launch.
Два пакета. 10.
Да, красота. Командир.
10.
10 уже.
11.
Зацените, там эти кружочки.
Вот это наши валят их.
12.
Смотри, сколько они пустили, и все сюда пускают.
Да, да. Зацените-ка.
Это они тут переместили.
Командир.
Нихера себе.
So that's obviously not going to help. And the ATACMS itself, the Army Tactical Ballistic Missile System, it fires in a very plain ballistic trajectory. It goes up and then it comes back down in a way that our Iskanders no longer do. We've evolved past the limitations of that particular, should we say, approach vector. And this means that all of our air defense is more than capable of shooting down a large, relatively slow target on approach. The ATACMS cannot be used to overwhelm air defenses because, they require the replacement of all of the HIMARS's tubes. So I hardly see how the introduction of the ATACMS will do anything other than perhaps succeed once in hitting some poor bloke's house in Crimea.
And to add to that, what Ukraine had been doing with the HIMARS is launching other multiple launch rocket systems that they have with unguided rockets, along with the guided HIMARS. And what that does is saturate the air defense systems that Russia has in a particular area. You cannot really do that with ATACMS. The whole point of ATACMS is it's firing much further than anything else that you have. You don't have anything else to launch with it at that range to saturate air defenses. So it really will be many fewer targets for Russian air defense to deal with. I also believe that that article about Russia adapting to the HIMARS, they talk about dispersing their supply lines, and there's many things that you can do to deal with this, and they'll just do the exact same thing with the ATACMS. And as you mentioned, the Iskander missile system is more capable than the ATACMS, more numerous, and this is something that if it can win a war, Russia is going to win the war first. So is there anything else you want to talk about regarding the battalion tactical group? I guess some closing thoughts.
I will sort of circle back to the ATACMS for a second, to a point you have been making very frequently. The Ukrainian army had the Tochka U system, a theater ballistic missile. So giving it the ATACMS is not a capability it had not had before. Other than a particularly heinous war crime, the Tochka U has not been used to any, success throughout this entire conflict. The most damage it has done is to the citizens of Donetsk City.
And I'm not an expert on the Tochka U, but what type of guidance does it have? Is it capable of hitting a target more or less precisely, say with GPS guidance?
Well, it's not GPS guided. It's inertial gyro, so it's not as precise. It's not satellite guided the way the Iskander is, for example. The Tochka U has, shall we say, issues with precision. It can hit something about a football field in size. So it could land at one end, it could land at the other. It's not the most precise of systems. Ukraine has much older ones, the Luna. They might even have a Mars or two lying around, but those have a dispersion of about 300 meters. So I don't think that could work on any sort of ammo dump or concentration of anyone, really.
Okay. So with that said, if you have any closing thoughts about the battalion tactical group itself, and then once again, just please tell my audience where people can find and follow your work and the rest of the team at Donbass Devushka.
Absolutely. Well, as a closing thought, the BTG is Russia's primary armored fist. It is what strikes her enemies, and it is what defends her from harm. We have seen the number of them expand significantly, and with the large-scale reinforcement of the Russian armed forces in general, up to 1.5 million or so men, I expect we shall see a lot more than the 170 or so that we have now. As to where you can find me, I co-host Calibrated with Scott on the Donbass Devushka podcast, which you can find on Spotify, and you can find on our locals simply by Googling Donbass Devushka Spotify or Donbass Devushka Locals. You can also find us on our Telegram channel, Donbass Devushka, where we share news from the battlefields, various analysis, etc., etc., at t.me/Donbass Devushka.
Yes, and again, all of the links to everything will be in the video description below, as well as a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. I want to thank you, Alex, for taking the time to share your unique perspective. We hear from many Western military people with military backgrounds in the West. You are a military man with experience in Russia, so I think this was very insightful for all of us. Thank you again, and I hope to have you back on soon.